What's up, guys? For this exceptions unit, I'm just going to go over the things to know. Know what exceptions can happen under what conditions. So that's down here. So we have 9 potential testable exceptions, or exceptions that might be on the test. The first one is string index out of bounds. So what this is whether you're trying to find a certain index of the string. It can be either too less or in the negatives, or it could be too high, or for this case, hello is only 0 to 4 and it's 5, right? So that's out of the certain range we have, so that's what causes that index. Class cast exception is when you're trying to cast one object from a certain class to another class, which is not allowed. So for this case, x is currently an integer and you're trying to turn that integer into a string, which is not allowed, so that's a class cast exception. For illegal state exception, this is only for the constructor. So this is whenever the constructor, the parameters or the values in the constructor are not correctly defined. So that's when an illegal state exception would be caused. A no such element exception is that if you have a text file and there's nothing in there, there's nothing in there to read, right? So then it'd be no such element exception. And then for the null pointer exception, that's basically saying if you're ever trying to find the values of a null, in this case, there's a string s that is null and you can't find the length of null, right? Or if an int x was null and you try to multiply it, you can't multiply a null. So that's why it'd be a null pointer exception, because you're trying to do things with a null, which is not allowed. For arithmetic exception, it's basically whenever math, you're breaking rules of math, and that's not good. So that'd just be an arithmetic exception. Array index out of bounds is basically the same thing as a string index out of bounds, except that it's only for an array. And then illegal argument exception is whenever the parameter or the values of a method or something are not not correctly defined, then you would throw an illegal argument exception. And then index out of bounds is the parent class of array index out of bounds and string index out of bounds, and it basically does the same thing, except it's more broad. Okay, those are all the exceptions that we need to know. So what are checked exceptions? So checked exceptions are the one in the orange here, and these checked exceptions are the ones that are not in the programmer's control, right? So for instance, file not found exception, there's no way for the programmer to check whether or not this file exists. There's no way for this programmer to know that this file is not there, right? So they can't really stop this exception from happening. They can catch the exception, but they can never stop this exception from being thrown by a method or anything, because there's no way to check using code whether or not this file is there. So that's what a checked exception is. And most checked exceptions, or not all checked exceptions, must be either used by throws, or you must catch them. You can't just not handle them. So the compiler checks whether or not you either have them as a throws or you have them caught using a catch method. So in this case, for example, if you're doing a class which uses the file reader, you'd have to throw an IO exception, or you have to throw a file throws a file not found exception or IO exception, so that the compiler lets you compile this code, because the compiler checks whether or not you have handled this certain all these checked exceptions. And then unchecked exceptions are all the runtime exceptions you see here. On all of these, the programmer can stop these exceptions from being thrown, right? So for this case, let's go into this code, right? And then we have this class here, A, and it has this method, withdraw int amount. If amount is greater than balance, then we're throwing this illegal argument exception, right? For now, we'll get rid of this what happened? Oh shoot, wait. Oh, bank. So since y is 25 and balance is 10, so 25 is greater than 10, so we're throwing this illegal argument exception. But the programmer can stop this exception by being thrown, because they can check whether or not this, like, instead of using this if statement to throw a new illegal argument exception, they can just use a print statement and say amount is too big or amount is like whatever, right? So they don't have, there's ways for the programmer to check whether or not the parameter is right instead of just throwing an exception. So in this case, they can be like, instead of throwing this print statement, they can simply just print out what the heck. But you get my point. They can just print out instead of throwing an exception. So those are all runtime errors, and that's something a programmer can control. And then the difference between throw and throws. Throw is when you want this exception to be caused as the moment this line is read, right? So as soon as the compiler reads this line, throw new illegal argument exception, it throws the exception, right? As soon as it reads this line, it throw illegal argument exception. But in the instance of throws, it's saying, like, when the compiler reads throws, it's saying, okay, if I ever run into a case where this exception occurs, I will throw it. It's basically telling the compiler that if you ever run into this exception, just throw it. I don't want to catch it. I don't want to do anything with it. I want you to throw it. And this mainly happens with checked exceptions. One way the compiler checks these exceptions is that when you say throws file not found, whenever the compiler runs into this exception, it knows that, oh, the programmer just wants me to throw this exception, and it'll throw it. So it's a way for the compiler to know what the programmer wants to do with that exception. And then for the try clause, what it does is basically it's a block of code that could have potentially like bad logic in it, I guess. So why we use it is that if you like ever think that your code can cause an exception, you can put it in this try block as a way to prevent the exceptions from occurring using the catch block. So, and how you do it is just a try with these squiggly brackets. And then after the try, you use the catch clause. What it does is basically it looks at the try block and whatever code is in there, and if it causes an exception, it catches that certain exception. So the whole point of a catch is to basically take that exception that's being thrown, and instead of actually throwing it, you can do other things. You can print out why it's being thrown. You can print out an error. But instead of having to like hard stop the code, it's a way for you to keep the code running while still addressing this issue. And how you do it is you write catch, and you like put in the parentheses the certain exception you're trying to catch. So in our case here, if we're throwing the illegal argument, right? So if we want to if you want to throw an exception, or if we want to catch an exception, we have to catch the illegal argument exception, because that's the one that a.java is throwing. A.java is throwing illegal argument exception, so that's the one we have to catch. We can't catch file not found because that exception is not being thrown. And then the finally clause, it's basically a block of code that runs no matter what. So if there is an exception, it still runs. It still like puts the code in. If there is an exception, it still runs. It's like a no matter what. It's like a fail-safe basically. And people usually use this when they're reading or writing files, right? So if something happens and there's a exception in the file, usually they use it to close it and save all the data no matter what happens. It's a fail-safe. And then the right combination is first you do try, and then and only then can you do catch or finally. There doesn't have to be a finally, there doesn't have to be a catch, but there has to be a try. You can do try catch, you can do try catch, and you don't need a finally. As you see here, we don't need a finally. And same thing with catch. We can do a finally, and we know this will cause an error, bank that would draw, but even if there's an error, you can see amount is too big. It's hard to really see it, but it's right there in this code, right here. From here, right here, amount too big. So even though there's an error, the finally still causes the system.out.print to run. And then lastly, the difference between errors and exceptions. So errors are things that, like, if an error happens, there's no going back. There's no like fixing it. But for an exception, you can always catch the exception, or there's multiple ways to handle exceptions so that even if one is thrown, you can like keep the code going. You can still let the code run even though there is something that went wrong. But for errors, there's no way to stop once an error is thrown. So yeah, those are things you need to know for the test. Pretty nice and short video, I guess. I don't know what else to talk about really. Hope this helped. I don't know if I explained it right, but I guess we'll see. Bye bye.